have to say that I am super excited about today's conversation. And first, I want to thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today with Irené Turtle. She is a leadership development coach. She is a powerhouse. She is a consultant, she's an executive coach, and she also happens to be a member of Leadership Global. And today, Irené is going to talk about how to develop the biggest predictor of your success, which is your EQ. It's not your IQ, it's your EQ. And I'm Linda Fisk. I'm the CEO of Leadership Global, and I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome all of you to the program today. Leadership Global has the most impactful community of extraordinary women in the world. We unleash the full potential of high-performing and growth-oriented leaders in a confidential, supportive, and private community. Leadership Global helps members accelerate their success by defining their vision, growing their leadership, expanding their influence, and leaving a lasting legacy. I have to say, if you are not yet a member of Leadership Global and you want to know more about this remarkable community of women leading across business, politics, and entertainment, then please reach out. It would be my honor and pleasure to get to know all of you individually. Now, for today's topic, this is going to be fascinating. I think that most people agree now that you can't really change the IQ you were born with, but did you know that's actually not the strongest predictor of success? In fact, your emotional intelligence, or your EQ, is literally the strongest predictor of top performance. Your education, your training, your technical expertise actually becomes less and less relevant as you take on more and more advanced leadership roles and deal with more complex people issues. And while you may not be able to change your IQ, the good news is you can develop your EQ. And actually, that matters more. In fact, did you know that over 90% of top performers across all industries were found to have exceptional EQ? People with higher EQ earn more money, make more sales, achieve higher productivity, have a greater sense of well-being, and are actually less susceptible to disease. And they, of course, have a much more positive attitude. So I am so excited that all of us get to learn from Irené Turtle, why am I having trouble with this? Leadership development consultant and executive coach. And she's going to explain emotional intelligence and how you can learn and develop your own EQ. Of course, some people are born with it already, and you know those people, they're charming, they're people you just want to be around, you want to follow them, you appreciate them as leaders. But the good news is the rest of us can improve and change our EQ. So let me tell you a little bit about Irené before we get going. Irené provides leadership coaching for entrepreneurs and executives, and she really specializes in systemic team coaching. She focuses on working with technology and high growth companies where excellence in leadership is especially crucial. Specifically, she helps her clients develop confidence and build on their communication, their conflict resolution, delegation, and team development skills. She also works with teams on identifying their cause of dysfunction and then developing their mission, their purpose, their values, and helping them succeed as a cohesive unit, as a high-performing team. So today, Irené brings over 25 years of experience working with companies in technology, entertainment, customer products, financial services, consulting services, healthcare, internet, as well as nonprofit and academic organizations. I'm not sure there's many industries there that weren't mentioned. So I am so pleased to be able to welcome Irené Turtle to today's program to talk about EQ. Irené, thank you for being here.
Well, Linda, thank you for setting this up. And it's really great to see people from all over the world, and very excited to talk to you about emotional intelligence, what it is, what it isn't, and how we can make it better.
I love that. So to begin with, Irené, we should probably level set and describe emotional intelligence and what that actually looks like. So can you describe it a little bit, maybe define it?
Sure. Well, emotional intelligence isn't one thing. It's a set of social and emotional skills that helps us understand ourselves and our emotions, helps us deal with challenges, helps us understand other people, and helps us manage relationships, because all of us live among and work with a lot of other people. There's 4 basic elements to emotional intelligence, and then there's a lot of subsets. The first one is self-awareness. How well we know ourselves, what's our self-confidence, how accurately we assess ourselves. I think it was Benjamin Franklin said there are 3 hard things. One is steel, one is diamonds, and the other one is self-knowledge. The second aspect is how well we manage our emotions. So how well is our self-control? How well do we express ourselves? The third facet is how well we understand other people's emotions and how they're showing up. And when you put all of that together, the last piece is how well we manage relationships with other people. So, Linda, I have a question for you.
Okay.
If you think about the very best leader or boss that you've worked with or seen, or best boss that you've ever had, how would you describe them? And this is something, if everybody else would like to do the same, you could put the things you would describe in the chat. That would be great. But what about you, Linda?
I would love to see what everyone adds to the chat. But for me, I think the descriptors I would use is they were incredibly transparent. I felt like they were very honest. I felt like they were a very thoughtful and intentional communicator. And then importantly, I always felt as though they had my back. I felt like the boss that I'm thinking of was someone that was championing me in all ways. They wanted to see me succeed. They wanted to see me thrive. They cheered me on when we had huge wins and huge successes. And I just always felt like my success was her success. And there was this incredible sense of teamwork and partnership in my performance, and how that impacted the business and how it reflected on my boss, the CEO.
Mm-hmm. That was wonderful, Linda. And that person that you described sounded like they had incredibly high emotional intelligence. The best person I've ever worked with, and this was very early in my career, we were in a meeting often with this very disruptive director who was a peer of Jimmy, my boss, and he would always try and derail the meeting. And no matter what he did, no matter when the rest of us were going, this is a train wreck, Jimmy would stay calm. He would keep his composure. And then he had an ability to read the room and realize when this other guy had gone too far, and he'd bring us back. He would get consensus. He would read the room, and he would build a bond with everybody and get us back on track. And I remember asking him, how do you do that? And he said, well, the only person I can control is myself. But, he wasn't willing to let the other guy undermine him. And he said, we have a job to do. Let's get it done. I will find a way to get it done. So what he displayed was, well, first of all, confidence in his own ability. He also showed enormous self-control, because the other guy was a bully, let's face it. And then he showed a lot of empathy for the other people and what we were all feeling. And he had the ability to build a relationship with the other team members and get the job done, which, he was pretty masterful. And I think that's what started my journey on trying to understand and delve into the whole world of leadership, what made a good leader, what made a bad leader, and everything in between. At that point, of course, I didn't have a framework. This is a long time ago. I didn't have a framework. Emotional intelligence wasn't a term that was in our common lexicon back then. But once I discovered that it was, I was off and running. I was hooked.
Yeah. And I love some of the descriptions that we're seeing here. Karen said her favorite boss was accessible, kind, fun, understood her, wanted her to succeed, much like my experience. Helped me start my first PR agency in LA by being my first client. That is just beautiful. Lorene said, fair, created a trusting environment, championed me, and trusting communication. Raymond said, honest and fair. Patty said, had faith in me and trusted me. Raymond said, empathetic. Let's see, Heather said, good listener, honest, collaborative, challenging his employees, but in a respectful way, articulate, empathetic. And then Laura said, gave really constructive, learning-centered feedback. Hattie said empowering. Joanne said inclusive. AJ said approachable. I love those descriptions. And interestingly, they all describe EQ, not EQ. And I love that. So we should talk a little bit about the difference between IQ and EQ, and maybe even EI, which is a brand new term. So can you talk a little bit about IQ and how that's different from EQ, and then this new term that some people may not have heard yet, which is EI?
Well, most people have heard of IQ because for hundreds of years now, it's how most people considered, or it was the way they measured success, especially in the corporate world. And it's how we analyze, how we rationalize. It's, people with IQ are very often good at learning and regurgitating, which is why they do well in exams. The term EQ or EI, now, it doesn't matter which one you use. It depends on whose psychological study you follow, if it's Goldman or Baron, who are psychologists, but it means the same thing. One uses EQ, the other one uses EI, but it means the same thing. So as I said, that is all about understanding ourselves, managing ourselves, understanding other people, and then how we put all of that together to manage our relationships with other people.
Yeah, that's what we see in the chat is it's that extraordinary gift of being able to manage the other people's reactions, your reaction, being able to approach situations with a sense of calm and maybe actually an objective curiosity about what's happening. It's someone who is sensitive to their own emotions and someone else's emotions. But what do you think is, Iréné, the biggest myth around this whole IQ, EQ dynamic?
Well, because it's not a new concept, but it's certainly a new field of study over the last 30 years. It's really only in the mid-90s when that term became commonplace. Before that, we talked about people skills and street smarts. And my mother used to say, they have a bad manner or they have a good manner. But I think that the myth is that if we're smart, if our IQ is off the charts, that will make us successful. And I'm not saying that IQ isn't important, it is. And IQ will get you in the room, it will get you into school, it will get you the job, but it may not keep you there and it may not help you progress. As I said, there's been an awful lot of research that's been done over the last 30 years. And what we now know is that IQ is possibly only as much as 20% of a factor in helping you be successful. All the research shows us that high EQ or high EI, depending on which you prefer, it's the biggest predictor of performance, high performance in leaders, and in fact in everyone. And 90% of top performers, star performers, those are the people in the top 10% of the company or their bracket, have high EQ. So the research also shows that even if you're not working in a corporation, even if you're not a leader, even if you don't run your own business, this this having better, higher EQ will help you be healthier, have more balanced relationships. They even now think it helps you live longer. But in terms of if you do work for a company, higher sales, higher productivity, higher retention, all of those things that, for some people don't always connect, but the research bears it out over and over again, regardless of who does the research.
I love that. So, let's dig into EQ a little bit to understand. You've defined it and described it, but let's dig into how it's measured and how people can actually begin to develop their EQ. So let's start with the baseline. How do you know what your EQ is? How well you're doing in emotional intelligence? I think everyone feels like, oh no, I'm terrific in terms of emotional intelligence. I would score off the charts. But really measure EQ, and how do you know kind of how your emotional intelligence, what the baseline is, and what you need to do to develop that as a skill set?
Mm-hmm. Well, you hit the nail on the head, Linda, because it all starts with self-awareness. I'm a firm believer as a leadership coach and a team coach, you can't change what you're not aware of. So some people, again, they come out of the box with tons and tons of self-awareness and accurate self-assessment, because it's not the same thing. But to develop it, well, obviously, the first thing to do is, ask the audience, is get feedback from your friends, your family, your co-workers, your boss. If you have a boss in a corporate environment, you're going to have a performance review typically, and people will either tell your boss, or your boss will tell you, or sometimes they tell HR. I'm working with somebody right now who's a phenomenal salesperson, but very, very jagged edges, shall we say, in terms of emotional self-control. And so whether he was aware of it or not, I think he was a little bit. He just didn't care enough to do anything about it. Now he's being asked to work on that. So if you're not sure, and we're never really, we all have blind spots. So we may think we're a really good listener. If you think you're a great listener, say you give yourself a 4 out of 5, ask all the people around you that know you how they would rate you honestly. And if they're rating you a 1 or 2 and you're rating yourself a 4 or 5, there's a gap there. That's what we call a blind spot. So asking other people, obviously, if you're working with a coach or going through an emotional intelligence program with your team, there are a lot of psychologically researched and validated assessments. The one I work with is called EQI, but there's a couple, 2 or 3 others that have lots of acronyms that I can't remember right now. So, but there's also some, I, for example, have a paper or an electronic assessment that I call leader or liability. So you can use that to assess yourself. You can also give it to your coworkers or your boss or your customers, your vendor, and that's a great way of getting feedback. Some people don't necessarily want feedback, but if you really truly want to be self-aware, you may need help with it. You may need that input from other people.
Yeah, and I think, it's very common for people to overestimate how well they're doing in terms of emotional intelligence. That's just a natural human trait. And so let's break down EQ a little bit. What are some of the key elements of EQ, or as you said, Iréne, EI? What are the key elements there?
Well, if we're talking about self-awareness, like I said, is how well we know ourselves, how well we understand our own emotions, how confident we are. I find that's one of the areas that I work with my clients an awful lot. Confidence, I think, Linda, is something sometimes we just need to work on it to get it better, but it can also be the first casualty of a trauma. And a trauma shows up different ways for different people. It could be bullying, which you and I have talked about before, workplace bullying. It could be a divorce. It could be a bankruptcy. It could be any kind of family emergency. It can also be as a result of not getting that promotion. Or it can be as a result of getting that promotion and having imposter syndrome and not feeling like you're equipped for the promotion. So that's very much a part of self-awareness and the accurate self-assessment. The next part, that second quadrant, is managing our emotions. I think if you think about politicians, corporations, sports people, so many of them derail very publicly and very for all the world to see because of their emotional self-control. Again, I have worked with a lot of people who we don't really have time to go into it here, but they have an amygdala hijack. It's like, I didn't know what I was thinking. They just lose their rag and they go off. I was a consultant with a company a few years ago where the CEO would rant quite often in a meeting, in a room, in front of the entire company at a town hall. And that self-control is probably one of the biggest derailers for people if they're not, first of all, understanding their emotions and then finding a way to manage them. Like my boss, Jimmy, he was great at doing that. The other part of understanding our emotions is, how we show up with other people. The third category of how aware we are of other people and their emotions, probably the one, again, that I work with a lot is empathy. And I know in the chat, a lot of people said empathy. Empathy, as most people know, is an ability to feel what other people are feeling, or at least understand what other people are feeling. And that isn't always because of what they say, it's what they don't say. It's the body language, it's a feeling. It's also, if you walk into a room, that what we call in corporate speak, organizational savvy, and this isn't just in organizations, you walk into a room and you can pick up on things. You know when to tell the joke and when not to, what to say and what not to say, etc. And then the last part really is, by the way, there's about 18 different elements of this, and we don't have time to go into all of them. So I'm just hitting the ones that I think I come across a lot as a team coach and as an individual coach. The relationship management, it's hard, I think, to be a really good leader or to be a good business owner if you don't have self-control, if you don't have confidence, if you don't have empathy. So putting all of those things together, somebody said, I think in the chat, their boss or their best leader gave them fantastic feedback. That's really an element of emotional intelligence as well, is holding people accountable, giving them feedback, setting expectations. Our biggest unit of work now appears to be the team. And you put a really, really smart person with low emotional intelligence in charge or even as part of a team. And you may find it doesn't turn out that well. So being able to, like my boss, Jimmy, read the room, control the people who are trying to derail it, build bonds, be able to influence people. Those are all the elements of relationship management. And again, you know, not everybody has all of those things. And when they don't have some of those things, it doesn't mean they're bad or they're not good people. It means that, you know, they could develop them. Because the good news, and I think I skipped over this, is, you know, personality is fixed. We can't change our personality. Our IQ is also fixed. Most people would agree, and we can't change that. The great news is that emotional intelligence is something that we can learn. It can be trained, it can be developed. So you can go from good to great by working on some of the elements of that, you know, that need some working.
I love that, Iréne. Thank you. So we have a question from Preeti that I thought I would offer. And he said, can you discuss gender and ethnic differences, since most workplaces are Caucasian, male dominated, and different people process emotions differently? Melody Wilding talks about sensitive strivers. So can you speak a little bit about how to create empathy on the workplace, where there's going to be lots of different cultures and lots of different groups of people working effectively together?
Well, to the gender issue, from the research that's been done, what we know is there's not a lot of difference, very minor difference between men and women in terms of their emotional intelligence. There are some things I think that women rate a little bit higher on, one of them being empathy. But in terms of, well, I think the leader is the leader of a team. While, you know, when you work with teams, it's important. The leader is just one aspect of it, but the leader is the, if you like, the emotional barometer of the team. So if the leader isn't sympathetic, empathetic to gender issues, cultural issues, where you come from, how you show up, it will be a lot more challenging. But everybody on a team needs to improve and have good emotional intelligence, because it's no one's responsibility. Just like, you know, my old boss Jimmy said, it's his responsibility to take care of his own self-control, his own emotions. So, but the leader and the culture are so important, because if you have a culture where diversity of ideas, apart from cultures, backgrounds, educations, genders, is not valued, then you might be the lone wolf. But I think it's everybody's responsibility to work on what they can control.
Yeah, I love that. And be focused on what you can control, instead of naming, blaming, and sort of complaining, right? So naming, blaming, complaining. So real quickly, you know, one of the things that you talked about is this idea of cultural competence being part of EQ. So having a level of emotional intelligence also means having a level of cultural competency. And I have to say that, to me, EQ, personality, and IQ do all interact. They all are very different, but there is an interaction between the three. So can you talk a little bit about that, EQ, personality, and IQ interaction?
Sure. Well, I think we're all like a puzzle, right? We're all unique, and we're made up of IQ, our emotional intelligence, our personality, and the other key thing that I work with a lot, which is our talents. So we, you know, the talents and the IQ and the personality, we sort of come out of the box with those. But some people think, well, if I have high IQ, then that must correlate to high EQ. And in fact, there is zero correlation. There's no correlation between IQ and EQ, and none between personality and EQ. But again, let's focus on, I always say, work on what we can improve, work on what we can strengthen, work on what we can change. And just as we have those talents, which I think also a really good leader understands your talents and, you know, works with them and encourages you with them. But I also work a lot with talents, and talents, you can't necessarily change them, but you can strengthen them and make them into strengths by using them, learning them, and perfecting them. So, I mean, EQ, when there's a hijack, that can affect your IQ. So, for example, when we say we have that, when people have that meltdown and they say, when they behave really, really badly and they go, I don't know what just happened, their IQ actually goes down too, but they're not correlated in terms of one doesn't determine the other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure does. And, you know, you just mentioned that there are certain strengths that can be developed, skills that can be developed. And as a leader, we rely on that, the process of continuous improvement. You know, if we are humble enough to recognize we don't have all the answers, and we're all in a process of developing and evolving and growing and changing, then we recognize that our skills and our strengths are always being developed. How can EQ be developed? And how can that be worked on beyond what you're born with?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it starts with awareness, because how can you change or develop what you're not aware of? You might have an inkling and it might be right or it might not be right. But, you know, even if you have low EQ, say you have low confidence, that's something I work with all the time and have great results helping people improve their confidence. But even if you're not working with a coach, there's lots of things you can do. You can, first of all, learn what your talents are. You know, anyone who works with me knows I'm a huge fan of Gallup Clifton Strengths, and then I use another system that works with that called Core Clarity, which really helps people understand what their talents are. So understanding your talents and using those and spending much more of your time working with your talents will also make you more successful. So the two are very connected in a way. So trying to, for example, work on something that you just, first of all, don't like to do and aren't very good at is kind of a waste of time. But that self-awareness is the first step. And then there's all sorts of self-help tools. But if you're in a corporation and you happen to have the luxury of a coach, or you have the ability to participate in an emotional intelligence training program, those are all ways that you can do it. But there's tons of books on it. There's tons of materials out there to help you do that. But again, you know, like any good coach would say, it's awareness, then it's action, and then it's accountability. So the 3 A's of, you know what it is you're working on, have a plan, and then have someone, whoever that is, to hold you accountable so that you can continuously improve, because that's the goal.
Yep, that's right. So let's talk about the cost of not developing your EQ, not taking this seriously, seeming like, oh, that's kind of fluffy, soft stuff that I don't have to pay attention to. You know, I have a meteoric rise into leadership and I'm doing just fine. So my EQ must be pretty good because I made it this far. But what's the cost of not developing your EQ, not becoming self-aware, not really putting together some sort of action plan to continue to work on it and develop it?
Well, there's a couple of ways of looking at that. A lot of the people I work with are off the charts smart IQ, and they've spent a lot of time working in perfecting and honing those technical skills, and really a lot less time working on their emotional intelligence, their, if you want to call it, powerful people skills, their ability to relate and so on. And as most people know, when you climb the corporate ladder, you get to a point where those technical skills, your job history, your all of those things they don't go away, but they become less and less important. A lot of people, like when you ask a lot of executives or business owners, what do you spend the most of your time doing? And usually things that they don't like, which is dealing with people problems, dealing with clients, dealing with vendors, dealing with teams. That's the ultimate challenge for most people because it's so complex. We throw all these people into a team, call them a team, and expect them just to flourish, and it doesn't work like that. So from the point of view of getting to the next level, so again, your emotional intelligence in certain areas might be good, but if you take it to the next level, then that will make you even more successful. And especially in a corporate environment, it may be the difference between getting the promotion and getting to the C-suite if that's what you want to do. For other people, the cost, it may be their job. You know, the corporate world is littered with bodies who have, you know, they got hired because they were smart and they had all the right credentials, and then their EQ let them down. Very often, like I said, it's their self-control. But also, if you run a company, the research shows that having all your team have better, higher, more developed EQ will help you have better sales, better retention, have a happier, more engaged workforce. So if you ignore that, you ignore it at a cost.
Yeah, I think that's right. That there's a cost to not developing your EQ along with your strengths, along with your skills, along with your leadership development, very holistic way. So what are some of the ways that someone can take steps right now to become more self-aware, do some sort of benchmarking to understand truly where their EQ level is, and then create accountability around their EQ, create a level of, action planning around developing their EQ and measure it. And then last question is, are there places where someone can really do well in terms of EQ? Maybe with their family, they do really well. They're a wonderful father or mother, and they have extraordinary EQ when it comes to their kids. But then in the workplace, you see them kind of flip, and all of a sudden they have a totally different sort of level of EQ where they really do need to work on that. So how do you begin to even identify different levels of EQ within the same person?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are some people that say how you do something is how you do everything. And I'm inclined to agree with that most of the time. So if you're short-tempered and irritable and abrupt at work, chances are that in some other part of your life, you might be like that too. But it might be exacerbated at work because maybe in your family, you can control things more and you have brought your kids up to behave in a certain way. When you cross that office door, you're working with people, even if you've hired them and picked them and put them on your team, who don't always do what you want them to do. So, you know, I think those meltdowns, those emotional outbursts come from triggers. So you may see triggers at the office or with your team, or even if you're on a nonprofit board that you don't maybe see as much of at home, like people being late, people interrupting, people talking too much, people not talking at all, people not being prepared. So if those things trigger you, or, you know, there's all sorts of things that trigger people, that might be a lot harder to control at work. But in terms of your first question, like I said, first of all, pick one or two things that you want to work on. And if you're not sure, I think a lot of us have an idea of what we need to work on. But you have to get feedback. So if you have a boss or you have people that you trust, they will tell you. Send them an email and say, you know, I'm working on this. What would you say? And then find someone to hold you accountable and come up with a plan. So if, for example, just for the sake of argument, because it's a very common one, confidence, you might be very confident in your ability to speak one-on-one, but your confidence in front of a group, or doing a LinkedIn Live, or speaking in front of a crowd, or speaking in front of the board might be, you know, it all falls apart there. So coming up with a plan, what are some of the things I could do, for example, with that? There's lots and lots of different things. I mean, obviously for speaking in front of other people, Toastmasters is a great place to start. But it all starts with the awareness and then breaking it down into the steps that you can take, having someone to hold you accountable and having someone to continuously give you feedback. When I work with companies who pay for my services, we sometimes do a 360 and we ask all the people around the person being coached. We ask them the same question. So it could be people that report to you, people that you work with, the people that you report to, vendors, family members, customers. And when it's anonymous, people will give you very, very honest feedback. And again, I've worked with a lot of people who've been phenomenally successful, but there was one thing. And I think of a couple of people, one was an engineer and very, very smart and had, I would say overall, extremely good emotional intelligence, but suffered a little bit from the smartest person in the room syndrome. And when we did the 360, the feedback came back that, you know, he had to fight every battle. He had to be right for every argument. He showed up in a way where he totally lacked empathy in some ways, but also that ability to read the room. And he would sometimes make jokes in front of very senior people. And, you know, I'm from Ireland, we're all sarcastic, you know, he was sarcastic, we got on great, but that didn't fly in that audience. So it's, you know, again, when he found out what his blind spot was, he really set about with a very effective plan to tone that down and really show up differently and get from, in his case, really good to great.
Oh, that's great. It's so nice to know that with a little bit of feedback, someone can become much more self-aware and then put together an action plan to curb very specific behaviors that may appear to be a bit tone deaf to others, right? And I just think that's incredibly uplifting and encouraging. And it's inspiring to see people really make dramatic changes in the way that they control their emotions, the way they react to the emotions of others around them. That's hard work. And when people are able to do that work, it's so inspiring. So let's open it up a little bit. And I'd love to hear from you. You're welcome to add it in the chat, everyone, or you're welcome to come off mute and ask a question. I see that Raymond wrote a note here that's so smart. He said, really great point on being aware of your triggers. Through self-awareness, I learned how to control my reactions when triggers pop up. And I think, you know, the note that you made, Iréne, that how you do one thing is how you do all things, is probably right on the money. But I do think that there are certain environments that are much more likely to trigger an emotional reaction than others. And maybe that's what we see occasionally with people that are phenomenal parents, but they have temper tantrums at work, or, you know, they are tone deaf at work, but they're fabulous friends. And I've worked with a lot of women that I loved going out and having a glass of wine with, but I absolutely dreaded working with them on a project or an initiative. They were fabulous people. They were horrible coworkers. And so it could be that idea of a trigger. I would love to hear from you, everyone, and say, what are some of the questions that you have around emotional intelligence? Or what are some of the situations that you've struggled with? If you, for instance, know that you're working with someone who is not self-aware, who doesn't have a high level of emotional intelligence, and it's making your team miserable, or it's making you miserable, how do you begin creating a conversation with that person to say, hey, I'd like you to take a look at this. Hey, I'd like to bring this to your attention so that we can have a more cohesive, productive, and high-performing team. That would be my question, but I would love for anyone to offer their questions about what they're interested in learning more about.
So I'm going to start off, and I accidentally came across this seminar because I know Irene from a different life or a different world, and I was super impressed with the topic. But I think what's really a struggle for me is that I have a voice, and I definitely have a voice at home, and I manage that well, maybe too much. But at work, I tend to, in situations, play small and quiet it down, because I don't think that the person is ready for that conversation. And I think that a big attribute with an effective leader is to be coachable. And I don't see the coachability or the lifetime learning mindset with some of the people that are in charge above me. So I tend to adjust my my confidence level or my communication. I had a recent situation where a previous supervisor, horrible supervisor, nice friend, horrible. And I had to play small. And the reason for that was I did call out issues and situations and got written up for it because of the way I executed my communication, which I walked away bruised, and I shut it down. So now that that person's gone and failing forward, here I am today. I like the fact that I need to identify my blind spots so that I can advance further. But it is not easy, Linda, to have that conversation. We have huge egos in our department. And it's not easy for me to have that conversation with the person who I think is the one that's bruising our team, to say, hey, how can we talk a little bit about this? Here's some of the feedback I have for you, because they're not ready for that conversation. So if there is something you can, Irene or Linda, provide, how do you make that person ready? Or do I take the high road and continue to work on my self-awareness and how I can add value to the conversation to build that person as an ally, so eventually they'll come to me? So I'm really not sure.
Well, it's a great scenario to look into. I had a very similar situation with a client last week where she was saying things like, I'm playing small, I'm not speaking up, I'm quiet, I wait to be asked what I think, and I tone it down. And I think that's a sign of needing to strengthen your confidence and focusing on you, Lorraine. Let's face it, we have absolutely no control over how other people hear what we say, how they react, how they behave, how they show up. So all we can really focus on is ourselves. So I would start asking yourself, is it really confidence? And then how perhaps do I need to tailor the message? Because there's nothing wrong with tailoring your message. In fact, that's part of influence, which is relationship management, which is what is important to this person that I can get through to them so they can hear it in a way that that makes sense to them. But the other thing is, and let's call it what it is, sometimes most people leave their jobs and their companies because of their boss. So we have a great saying in Ireland: you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. So sometimes you're just in the wrong company with the wrong people. But before you get there is, look at your aspects of your how you're showing up and your confidence. And if you think you're playing small, why? There's lots and lots of, I'm happy to have a conversation with you offside about this.
The other thing I would say is I've had that exact situation, and what I do is own what's mine. So I will enter into a conversation with someone that I feel like has transgressed in some sort of really significant way, such that it's impacting team performance, it's impacting our ability to meet our goals, our objectives, it's impacting sort of the well-being of the team or my well-being. And so what I will say is, here's how I'm feeling, here's what I'm thinking, or here's what I'm learning. And I take ownership of that. And I'll say, I'm really learning that the way that I present problems really seems to be a trigger for some of my teammates. So what I'm learning is to listen before I create a solution. I ask questions more, I listen more. Do you find that works for you? And so what I do is sort of own that, whatever the situation is. This is what I'm learning, this is what I'm observing, this is what I'm feeling. And then are you learning that same thing or observing that same thing? So it's an open exchange. It's not saying you're doing something wrong. It's sort of saying, here's what I'm seeing in the dynamics of the team and what I'm learning from that.
And sometimes a really good question to ask is, would you like some input? Would you like some feedback? And if the answer is a flat out no way, then you know where you stand. But sometimes when you ask that question and phrase it in a different way, it makes a difference. It opens a window. It's worth a shot anyway.
I love that, Iréne. Mm-hmm. AJ said, and this is such a good question, Iréne, you mentioned the importance of developing your talents. I'm wondering why you think we should focus more on our talents rather than working on our weaknesses.
Oh, I love this question because AJ knows I am a huge fan of focusing on our talents, because just like we know focusing on our EQ, again, all the research, all the work that's been done over 50, 70 years proves that when we work in our talents, that's what makes us successful, not working on the things we're not good at, which are usually the things we don't like. So that's a little bit counterintuitive, sort of like the IQ thing. When you come home with your very first school report and you get 4 A's and a D, what does everyone hyperventilate on? Right? And if you think about the things that you are naturally talented at, when you develop those into strengths and you work there, first of all, the day goes faster. You don't know where it's gone. You love what you're doing. You can improve upon it. And doing those things that you're naturally talented at will make you successful. So first of all, of course, you have to know what your talents are. And that's why I use the Clifton Strengths to help you do that. Some of us, again, might think, oh, I'm great at being strategic, but maybe we're not accurate about that. So doing that assessment, which is only $19.99, is a wonderful, wonderful place to start.
Oh, that's great. All right. Well, I am going to wrap up today so we can end on time. But first, I want to thank Iréne Turtle. She is, as you can see, an amazing, insightful, and impactful coach. She is a leadership development consultant and executive coach with unique expertise around this whole area of team dynamics, team performance, and EQ. If you'd like to get in touch with Iréne, you will receive a copy of today's recording, and we'll include her contact information so all of you can reach out to have further discussion around this idea of emotional intelligence or EQ. Because as we've talked about, it is the strongest predictor of top performance. So this is a subject that you would do well to dive into deeply and really understand. I really want to thank Iréne, as well as all of you, for spending an hour with us to really dive into this important topic. As I noted, I'm Linda Fisk, the CEO of Leadership Global. And if you would like to learn more about this incredibly impactful community of extraordinary women around the world, like Iréne, who is one of our coaches, please let me know. It would be my pleasure and honor to meet with you and tell you more about our phenomenal community of extraordinary women. Thank all of you for being with us today and joining the conversation. And thank you, Iréne, for leading us through such an insightful conversation about a really important topic and sharing with us your enormous expertise. We are truly grateful.
It was my absolute pleasure, and thank you to everyone who came, and a big hi to Raymond in Germany, and everybody, AJ in Mexico, and everybody from all around the globe who took the time to come, and I hope you learned something.